Dr. Marcus Chen has been a xenolinguist specializing in Thessari nonverbal communication for 11 years, and he has learned through extensive experience that the most dangerous diplomatic incidents are often the ones that seem most clear-cut to the people involved. When everyone agrees they saw the same thing, when the evidence appears unambiguous, when the offense seems so obvious that questioning the interpretation feels like denying reality itself. Those are the situations that create the worst misunderstandings, because certainty prevents the careful examination that might reveal the interpretation is incomplete. He's sitting in a conference room at the human embassy on the Thessari homeworld, reviewing security footage of an incident that occurred 6 days ago during formal alliance ceremonies. The footage has been analyzed by multiple human diplomatic staff. The interpretation has been confirmed by security officers. The conclusion is consistent across every review. Ambassador Serath, a senior Thessari diplomat, made a deliberately insulting gesture toward the human delegation during a critical moment in the ceremony. The gesture is clearly visible in the footage. Serath raises her right hand to chest height, positions her fingers in a specific configuration that Thessari gesture databases identify as deeply offensive, holds the position for approximately 4 seconds while looking directly toward the senior human diplomat, then lowers her hand and continues with the ceremony as though nothing significant has occurred. It appears deliberate, unmistakable, the kind of calculated insult that would require formal diplomatic response and potentially damage the 5-year alliance between species. Captain Valen, the human security officer who filed the initial incident report, sits across the conference table from Marcus with the controlled frustration of someone who believes the situation is being overcomplicated unnecessarily. Dr. Chen, I appreciate that you're thorough, Valen says, his voice carrying professional courtesy that doesn't quite conceal impatience. But I'm not sure what additional analysis will reveal that we haven't already identified. The footage is clear. The gesture matches documented Thessari insult patterns. The timing and context indicate deliberate intent. Ambassador Serath made an offensive gesture toward our delegation during formal ceremonies. That's a diplomatic incident that requires response. Marcus has reviewed the footage 17 times since arriving at the embassy 3 hours ago. He's examined Serath's hand position from multiple camera angles. He's confirmed the gesture configuration against comprehensive Thessari nonverbal communication databases. He's analyzed the timing, the context, the surrounding circumstances. Everything Captain Valen says is accurate. The gesture does match documented patterns for a specific Thessari insult. The timing does suggest deliberate intent. The evidence does appear unambiguous, and yet something about the interpretation doesn't sit right with Marcus in ways he can't fully articulate. Walk me through what happened from your perspective, Marcus says, setting aside the footage for a moment. Not just the gesture itself, the full context of the ceremony and what you observed. Valen pulls up his incident report on the conference table's display. The ceremony was formal reception of the human delegation for annual alliance review, standard diplomatic protocol. Ambassador Serath was positioned near the center of the Thessari delegation, approximately 6 meters from our senior diplomat. Approximately 40 minutes into the ceremony, during the exchange of formal acknowledgments, Serath made the gesture visible in the footage, raised hand, offensive finger configuration, held for 4 seconds while looking directly at our delegation, then lowered and continued as though nothing had occurred. And your immediate response? Marcus asks. Controlled professional observation, Valen replies. I'm trained to recognize potential security incidents without reacting visibly. I noted the gesture, confirmed with other security personnel that they'd observed it as well, and filed the report after the ceremony concluded. Did Ambassador Serath show any other signs of hostility or tension during the ceremony? Marcus asks, Valen considers the question. No, her demeanor throughout was professionally cordial. The gesture was the only anomalous element in her behavior. And the Thessari response, when you raise the incident through diplomatic channels. Confusion, Valen admits. They've been consistently confused for 6 days. They don't deny that Serath made the gesture, the footage is clear, but they seem genuinely uncertain why we're interpreting it as insulting, which doesn't make sense given that the gesture is documented in their own cultural databases as offensive. Marcus nods slowly. This is the element that has been bothering him since he first reviewed the case materials. Thessari officials aren't defensive about the incident. They're not offering explanations or justifications. They're simply confused, as though they're looking at the same footage but seeing something different from what the humans are seeing. I need access to the full ceremony footage, Marcus says. Not just the clip showing the gesture, the complete recording from multiple angles, including broader room context. Why, Valen asks. The gesture is clearly visible in the existing footage. What additional context would change the interpretation? I don't know, Marcus admits honestly. But 11 years of studying Thessari nonverbal communication has taught me that gestures don't exist in isolation. They're part of broader communication patterns that include positioning, timing, and environmental context. When there's a disconnect between what appears obvious and how the Thessari themselves are responding, it usually means we're missing context that would make their perspective make sense. Valen doesn't look convinced, but he authorizes access to the complete ceremony recordings. I'll have the full footage transferred to your secure workspace, but Dr. Chen, the human diplomatic staff are expecting resolution on this incident. We can't let a clear insult go unaddressed simply because the Thessari are claiming they don't understand our interpretation. I'm not suggesting we ignore it, Marcus says. I'm suggesting we make sure we understand what actually happened before we demand diplomatic satisfaction for something that might not be what it appears to be. 3 hours later, Marcus is alone in his workspace reviewing footage from 7 different camera angles covering the full 2-hour ceremony. He's watching not just Ambassador Serath, but the entire room, the positioning of various Thessari and human officials, the flow of the ceremony, the broader context within which the gesture occurred. He's looking for something. He doesn't know what yet, just something that will explain the disconnect between the human interpretation and the Thessari confusion. The footage plays. The ceremony proceeds with formal precision. Thessari and human officials exchange acknowledgments, deliver prepared remarks, perform the ritual elements that alliance ceremonies require. 40 minutes in, Ambassador Serath makes the gesture. Marcus pauses the footage, studies the moment from multiple angles simultaneously. Serath's hand rises to chest height. Fingers configure in the pattern that databases identify as insulting. The position holds for 4 seconds, then lowers. What is he missing? He rewinds, plays the sequence again and again, watching not just Serath but everyone around her. The humans she's apparently insulting, the Thessari officials standing nearby, the broader room dynamics. There's something in Serath's eyes, in where she's looking during those 4 seconds. Marcus enlarges the footage, focuses specifically on her gaze direction. She's looking toward the human delegation. That's what the initial analysis concluded. But Marcus pulls up a different camera angle, one that shows not just Serath but what's beyond her line of sight in the direction she's looking. And suddenly something shifts in his understanding. Not complete clarity yet. Just the first edge of possibility that the interpretation everyone has accepted might be incomplete. Marcus spends the next 4 hours reviewing footage with obsessive attention to details that most analysts would consider peripheral to the main incident. Not just what Ambassador Serath did, but what else was happening in the room during those specific 4 seconds when she made the gesture. The Thessari delegation's positioning, the human delegation's positioning, the ceremony officials managing the formal proceedings, the various cultural advisors and diplomatic staff positioned throughout the reception hall. He's looking for context, for the thing that explains why Serath made a gesture that appears insulting while showing no other signs of hostility. For whatever the Thessari officials are seeing when they look at this footage that makes them confused rather than defensive about the accusation. At 11 p.m., Dr. Kethara, a Thessari cultural advisor assigned to assist human diplomatic staff, stops by Marcus's workspace on her way to evening quarters. "You're still reviewing the incident," she observes, her skin showing the tired blue of someone at the end of a long day. "Captain Valen mentioned you were conducting additional analysis." "I am," Marcus confirms. "Can I ask you something about Thessari, nonverbal communication?" "Of course," Kethara says, settling into a chair across from his workspace. "That's why I'm assigned here." Marcus pulls up the still image of Serath's gesture, hand raised, fingers in the configuration that databases identify as offensive. This gesture, in isolation, it's insulting. Databases are clear about that. But are there contexts where the same hand position might mean something different? Kethara studies the image carefully. Her skin shifts through analytical colors as she processes what she's seeing. That specific configuration. In most contexts, yes, it's offensive. It implies the recipient is unworthy of direct address. But she pauses, her skin showing contemplative purple. But gestures in Thessari communication are never truly in isolation. They're part of larger communicative acts that include positioning, gaze direction, and social context. The same hand configuration can mean different things depending on who it's directed toward and what broader communication it's part of. So this gesture could mean something other than insult. Marcus asks. "Possibly," Kethara says cautiously, "but I would need to see the full context to determine what else it might signify." The gesture configuration itself is ambiguous. It could be insult, or it could be a directional signal, or it could be a formal hold command. The interpretation depends entirely on context that a still image doesn't provide. Marcus feels something click into place, a hold command. "Yes," Kethara confirms. "In formal settings, senior Thessari sometimes use hand gestures to signal other Thessari to pause or wait, usually when someone is about to make a protocol error or when timing needs to be coordinated discreetly. The hand position is similar to the insulting gesture, but not identical. The difference is subtle enough that someone unfamiliar with the distinction might confuse them." She looks at the image more closely. "May I see the full footage context? Not just the still image, but the surrounding moments." Marcus plays the sequence for her. Serath raising her hand, holding the position for 4 seconds while looking toward the human delegation, then lowering it. Kethara watches silently, then asks, "Can you show me a wider angle? I want to see what else was happening in the room during those 4 seconds. Marcus switches to the camera angle that shows the broader reception hall. Plays the same 4-second sequence. Kethara's skin flashes to surprised white. "Oh, that's not what the human staff thinks it is." "What is it?" Marcus asks, feeling the edge of understanding getting closer but not quite reaching it yet. "Ambassador Serath wasn't directing that gesture at the human delegation," Kethara says, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone explaining something that should have been obvious, but was missed due to incomplete context. "She was signaling Elder Vethros, the Thessari official positioned behind the human delegation from her perspective. The gesture is a formal hold command, telling him to pause because he was about to step forward out of sequence during the ceremony." She rewinds the footage, plays it again, pointing to a Thessari elder partially visible behind the human officials. "There, you can see Vethros beginning to move forward just before Serath makes the gesture. He was about to deliver a ceremonial acknowledgement that wasn't scheduled for that moment. A protocol error that would have disrupted the ceremony and potentially embarrassed both species. Serath caught the error, signaled him to hold, and he stopped. The gesture saved the ceremony from an awkward incident. Marcus stares at the footage, with new understanding beginning to crystallize. So when she's looking toward the human delegation, she's looking past them, at Vethros, Thessari confirms. The humans were positioned between her and the elder she needed to signal. From the human's perspective, it appeared she was looking at them and making a gesture in their direction. But from Thessari cultural context, she was clearly addressing Vethros with a formal hold command that prevented him from making a significant protocol error. But why didn't Thessari officials explain this when the humans raised the incident? Marcus asks. Thessari's skin shows uncomfortable purple, because explaining it would require acknowledging that Elder Vethros nearly made a serious protocol error during formal alliance ceremonies. Vethros is highly respected, a senior cultural authority. Publicly revealing that he was about to step out of sequence would embarrass him significantly. Serath was being discreet in correcting him during the ceremony, and Thessari officials have been trying to remain discreet in not explaining what actually happened after the ceremony. She pauses. Thessari officials were confused by the human interpretation because from our cultural perspective, it was obvious that Serath was signaling Vethros, not addressing the humans. The possibility that humans would interpret the gesture as directed at them didn't occur to anyone because the context made it clear, to Thessari eyes, that the gesture was directed elsewhere. Marcus sits back in his chair, feeling the full weight of the misunderstanding settling into place. So for 6 days, humans have been demanding diplomatic satisfaction for an insult that never happened, and Thessari officials have been confused because they're trying to protect an elder's dignity by not explaining what Serath was actually doing. That's an accurate summary, Thessari confirms, her skin showing resigned blue. I need to see this more clearly, Marcus says. Need to confirm the interpretation before I bring it to Captain Valen and the diplomatic staff. He spends the next 3 hours reviewing every angle of footage, tracking Elder Vethros's positioning and movement, confirming that Serath's gesture timing corresponds exactly to the moment when Vethros begins moving forward out of sequence, confirming that Vethros stops moving precisely when Serath makes the gesture, indicating he received and understood the signal, building the case, not just showing what Serath did, but showing the complete context that transforms the interpretation from deliberate insult to discreet correction preventing protocol error. By 3 a.m., Marcus has assembled a comprehensive analysis showing Vethros's positioning behind the human delegation from Serath's perspective, Vethros beginning to move forward out of ceremonial sequence, Serath's gesture timing corresponding to Vethros's movement, Vethros stopping in response to the signal, the hand position matching Thessari formal hold command rather than insult gesture, the broader ceremonial sequence continuing smoothly after Vethros's near error is prevented. The evidence is clear, not new information that changes the facts, just complete context that changes everything about how those facts should be understood. What appeared to be deliberate insult was actually protective discretion. What looked like hostility was restraint exercised to prevent public embarrassment. What seemed unambiguous was incomplete interpretation, missing critical context. Marcus sits in his quiet workspace at 3 a.m., looking at footage that shows exactly what Captain Valen and the human diplomatic staff saw 6 days ago. The same gesture, the same timing, the same apparent direction toward the human delegation. Marcus calls an emergency meeting for 7 a.m. Captain Valen arrives looking tired and skeptical. The senior human diplomatic staff arrive expecting Marcus to present his analysis, confirming what they already concluded 6 days ago. Dr. Thessari arrives at Marcus's request to provide Thessari cultural perspective if needed. Thank you for assembling on short notice, Marcus begins, standing at the front of the conference room with the display showing the same footage everyone has reviewed multiple times. I've completed my analysis of the incident involving Ambassador Serath. What I'm about to show you isn't new footage. It's the same security recordings you've all seen. But I'm going to show you context that changes the interpretation completely. Captain Valen shifts in his seat. Dr. Chen, with respect, we've reviewed this footage extensively. Unless you've discovered evidence that the gesture databases are incorrect about the offensive meaning. The databases are correct, Marcus interrupts gently. The gesture configuration can be offensive in certain contexts, but it can also mean something entirely different in other contexts. And the context we've been missing is what Elder Vethros was doing during those 4 seconds when Ambassador Serath made the gesture. He pulls up a wider camera angle, the one showing not just Serath and the human delegation, but the broader reception hall, including the Thessari officials positioned throughout the space. Elder Vethros is here, Marcus says, highlighting a Thessari official positioned behind and to the right of the human delegation from Serath's perspective. During formal ceremonies, there's a specific sequence for when different officials deliver acknowledgments and perform ritual elements. Elder Vethros was scheduled to deliver his acknowledgment later in the ceremony, approximately 15 minutes after this moment. He plays the footage. Watch Vethros's positioning. Just before Serath makes the gesture, Vethros begins moving forward, stepping out of his designated position and beginning to approach the ceremonial center where acknowledgments are delivered. The footage shows exactly what Marcus described. Vethros, partially obscured behind human officials, beginning to move forward with the clear intent of delivering a ceremonial statement. Vethros was about to step forward out of sequence, Marcus continues. A protocol error that would have disrupted the ceremony and potentially embarrassed both species, interrupting a human official's scheduled acknowledgement with an unscheduled Thessari statement. He plays the next few seconds. Ambassador Serath sees Vethros beginning to move. She raises her hand in what we interpreted as an insulting gesture directed at the human delegation. But watch what happens. The footage shows Serath's gesture, hand raised, fingers positioned, held for 4 seconds. And critically, shows Vethros stopping mid-step, recognizing the signal and returning to his original position. The gesture wasn't directed at the human delegation, Marcus says. It was directed at Elder Vethros, who was positioned behind the humans from Serath's perspective. The hand configuration isn't the insulting gesture we identified in the databases. It's a Thessari formal hold command, a signal used in ceremonial contexts to tell someone to pause or stop, usually when they're about to make a protocol error. He pauses, letting the room process what they're seeing. Serath was looking toward the human delegation only because Vethros was positioned in that direction. She was preventing a protocol error discreetly, signaling Vethros to hold without drawing public attention to his near mistake. The gesture lasted 4 seconds because Vethros was slow to notice the signal. When he finally registered it and stopped moving, Serath lowered her hand, and the ceremony continued without incident. The conference room is completely silent. Marcus can see the understanding settling into place on multiple faces simultaneously. The moment when interpretation shifts from "this is what we saw" to "this is what was actually happening." Captain Valen is staring at the footage with an expression that has transformed from skeptical certainty to embarrassed recognition. We were positioned between Serath and the person she was actually signaling. From our perspective, it looked like she was addressing us. Exactly, Marcus confirms. From the human delegation's perspective, from your camera angles and your positioning in the room, Serath appeared to be making a gesture directed at you. But from Thessari cultural context, she was clearly signaling Vethros to prevent a significant protocol error. One of the senior diplomatic staff speaks up. Why didn't Thessari officials explain this when we raised the incident through diplomatic channels? If Serath was preventing a protocol error, That's a reasonable explanation that would have resolved the misunderstanding immediately. Dr. Thessari, who has been sitting quietly observing the human reactions, responds to this. Because explaining what Serath was actually doing would require acknowledging publicly that Elder Vethros nearly made a serious ceremonial error. Vethros is a highly respected senior cultural authority. Thessari officials were trying to protect his dignity by not revealing his near mistake. Serath was being discreet during the ceremony, and Thessari officials were trying to remain discreet afterward. So they accepted being accused of deliberate insult rather than embarrass an elder by explaining what actually happened, another diplomat observes. That's correct, Thessari confirms. From Thessari cultural perspective, protecting Vethros's dignity was more important than defending Serath against accusations that seemed, to Thessari eyes, obviously based on misinterpretation. The confusion arose because what was obvious to Thessari observers wasn't obvious to human observers who were missing the cultural context about what the gesture actually signified. The room falls silent again as the full scope of the misunderstanding becomes clear. Not a deliberate insult, not hostility or contempt, not anything requiring diplomatic response or formal satisfaction. Just a discreet signal preventing protocol error, interpreted as insult because the humans were positioned between the signaler and the intended recipient, and didn't have the cultural context to understand what they were actually seeing. Marcus displays the footage one more time, the complete sequence showing Vethros's near error, Serath's preventive signal, and Vethros's response. This is what was there all along, Marcus says quietly. We saw Serath make a gesture toward our delegation and interpreted it through the cultural framework we had available. That interpretation was reasonable given our perspective and our cultural knowledge, but it was incomplete. The complete context shows something entirely different. Not insult but protection, not contempt but discretion. Captain Valen is the first to speak after the extended silence. His voice carries genuine embarrassment. I filed an incident report accusing a Thessari ambassador of deliberate insult during formal ceremonies. I recommended formal diplomatic response. I created a 6-day crisis over a misunderstanding that should have been clarified with simple inquiry about context. You responded appropriately given the information available to you at the time, Marcus says, and he means it. The footage appeared to show deliberate insult. Your job is to identify and report potential security incidents. You did that job correctly. The failure was in interpretation, in not recognizing that what appeared obvious might be incomplete. The senior diplomat, who has been leading the human response to the incident, speaks with careful precision. Dr. Chen, based on your analysis, what response do you recommend? Informal acknowledgement that the incident was based on misinterpretation, Marcus says. Not formal apology, that would require acknowledging error in a way that might embarrass either species. Just quiet acknowledgement through appropriate diplomatic channels that we now understand what Serath was actually doing, and that no insult was intended or received. And Elder Vethros, the diplomat, asks. Never mentioned, Thessari interjects firmly. The entire purpose of Serath's discretion was to prevent public acknowledgement of his near error. Explaining our misunderstanding while protecting that discretion is the appropriate path forward. The senior diplomat nods slowly. I'll draft the appropriate communication to Thessari diplomatic channels, low-key, informal, simply acknowledging the misunderstanding without creating further incident around its resolution. The meeting continues for another 30 minutes, discussing implementation details, reviewing what lessons can be learned about cross-cultural interpretation, establishing protocols for how similar situations should be handled in future. But the decisive moment has already passed. The moment when understanding finally came into focus, when interpretation shifted from confident certainty to complete recognition, When everyone in the room stopped seeing what they thought they saw and started seeing what was actually there all along. The footage hasn't changed. The gesture is the same. The timing, the positioning, the context, all identical to what Captain Valen observed 6 days ago. But everyone in the room has transformed, because they finally understand. 3 days after Marcus's presentation, the incident that consumed 6 days of diplomatic attention and created genuine tension between species has been quietly resolved through informal channels that never acknowledge it was ever interpreted as an incident requiring resolution. Human diplomatic staff communicate to their Thessari counterparts that the gesture has been understood in its complete context. Thessari officials communicate quiet appreciation for the careful analysis that led to that understanding. Elder Vethros is never mentioned by either side. The alliance continues. The ceremonies that were scheduled during the week when the incident was being analyzed proceed without complication. Relationships that were strained by the misunderstanding return to normal functioning. From the outside, someone reviewing the diplomatic record would see a small notation. Clarification of ceremonial gesture interpretation completed through standard analytical protocols. No further action required. The crisis that nearly was resolved through the quiet work of seeing clearly what was there all along. Marcus is preparing to return to Earth, his analytical work complete, his expertise no longer needed for immediate crisis management. When Ambassador Serath requests a private meeting, they meet in one of the embassy's smaller conference rooms. Serath arrives without diplomatic staff or formal protocol. Just two professionals who were at the center of a misunderstanding that neither of them created but both were affected by. Dr. Chen, Serath begins, her skin showing warm gold that indicates genuine gratitude. I wanted to thank you personally for the analysis that resolved the confusion about my gesture during the ceremonies. I was doing the work I was brought here to do, Marcus replies. Analyzing cross-cultural communication and identifying where interpretation might be incomplete. You did more than that, Serath says. You saw what Thessari officials couldn't explain without violating discretion, and what human officials couldn't see without cultural context we hadn't provided. You found the bridge between those positions. She pauses, her skin shifting to contemplative blue. For 6 days, I was accused of deliberately insulting human representatives during formal alliance ceremonies. I couldn't defend myself without revealing what I was actually doing, protecting Elder Vethros from public embarrassment by discreetly correcting his protocol error. Thessari officials were confused because, from our cultural perspective, what I did was obviously directed at Vethros, not at the humans. But we couldn't explain that without compromising the discretion I was exercising. The humans couldn't have known, Marcus observes. From their perspective, from their positioning in the room, the gesture appeared to be directed at them. The interpretation was reasonable given their available context. It was, Serath agrees. That's what made the situation so difficult to resolve. Both sides were interpreting accurately based on the information they had. The misunderstanding arose not from error but from incomplete perspective. You provided the complete perspective that allowed both sides to understand what actually happened. She looks at Marcus with an expression of genuine curiosity. How did you know to look for broader context? Most analysts would have accepted the interpretation that appeared obvious in the footage. 11 years of studying Thessari nonverbal communication, Marcus says. I've learned that when there's a disconnect between what appears obvious and how Thessari are actually responding, it usually means there's context that would make the Thessari perspective make sense if I could identify it. Your officials weren't defensive about the accusation. They were confused. That confusion told me they were seeing something different from what we were seeing. So you looked for what they were seeing, Serath observes. I looked for what might be there that we weren't seeing, Marcus corrects. I didn't know what I was looking for, just that the certainty everyone felt about the interpretation was probably incomplete if it couldn't account for the Thessari confusion. Serath nods slowly. In Thessari culture, we have a concept called kelmara, roughly translated as the clarity that was always there. It refers to moments when understanding shifts not because new information arrives, but because we finally see what was present all along. What you did for both species was facilitate kelmara, helping everyone see what was actually there beneath the interpretation we'd constructed. That's a good description, Marcus agrees. The footage didn't change. The gesture didn't change. What changed was seeing the complete context that had been there from the beginning, but that we weren't perceiving because we were focused on the interpretation that seemed obvious. They sit quietly for a moment. Two people who were on opposite sides of a misunderstanding that neither created, now sharing the recognition that understanding often requires the patience to look beyond what seems obvious. I wanted to ask you something, Serath says, about human interpretive practices. When you were reviewing the footage and building your analysis, at what point did you know that the interpretation was wrong? Marcus considers the question. I didn't know it was wrong. Not with certainty. I just knew something felt incomplete about it. The certainty everyone felt didn't match the confusion Thessari officials were showing. That disconnect made me think there was context we were missing. But I didn't know what that context was until I saw Vethros's positioning and movement in the broader footage. So you were operating on uncertainty, Serath observes, questioning an interpretation that everyone else had accepted as obvious, without knowing what the correct interpretation would be. That's accurate, Marcus confirms. In cross-cultural analysis, certainty is often a warning sign. When everyone is certain they're seeing something clearly, it usually means they're not considering alternative interpretations. Uncertainty, the recognition that what seems obvious might be incomplete, is often more productive than confidence. Serath's skin shows deep contemplative blue. That's a valuable insight. Perhaps if Thessari officials had been less certain that the humans would obviously recognize what Serath was doing, we would have explained the context earlier instead of assuming the misinterpretation would resolve itself naturally. And perhaps if human officials had been less certain about the obvious insult, they would have inquired about context before filing formal incident reports, Marcus adds. Certainty on both sides prevented the clarity that would have resolved the situation immediately. Kelmara requires willingness to question what seems obvious, Serath says. That's difficult when the obvious interpretation is supported by clear evidence. It is, Marcus agrees. But sometimes the most important question isn't, what does the evidence show, but what might the evidence be showing that we're not seeing because we're focused on the interpretation that seems most clear. 6 weeks later, back on Earth and reviewing materials for a training seminar on cross-cultural interpretation, Marcus reflects on the incident that nearly created a diplomatic crisis between species. The certainty that seemed justified, the evidence that appeared unambiguous, the interpretation that everyone accepted because it matched obvious patterns in the available data. And the moment, quiet, undramatic, arriving at 3 a.m. in a workspace lit only by display screens, when he finally saw what had been there all along. Not new information, not hidden evidence, just complete context that changed everything about how the existing evidence should be understood. Understanding settling into place like a lens snapping into focus. What seemed threatening revealed as restraint. What looked like indifference revealed as patience. What appeared obvious revealed as incomplete. The room didn't change. The people in it did, because they finally saw clearly. That's Kelmara. That's the transformation that comes not from discovery but from recognition. That's the quiet, decisive moment when truth stops being obscured by interpretation and simply becomes visible for what it always was. A moment of clarity. When understanding finally comes into focus, and everything changes, not because the facts changed, but because everyone finally sees what the facts actually meant all along. The gesture that seemed like insult was protection. The confusion that seemed inexplicable was discretion. The crisis that seemed inevitable was misunderstanding. And the resolution came not from apology or negotiation or diplomatic maneuvering, but from simply seeing. Finally, completely, clearly seeing what was there all along. Kelmara, the clarity that was always there, waiting for someone patient enough to look past what seemed obvious and see what was actually present. That's truth. That's understanding. That's the quiet transformation that happens when the lens finally focuses and everything becomes clear.